Hey there, everyone. Coach Mark here. Before we dive into today's topic, make sure to find me over on Instagram as Coach Mark Estrabio. Also, I offer one-to-one coaching. It's what I do full-time, and the odds are really good I'd love to work with you. But with that being said, let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about German volume training, and before we really go into it and discuss applications, the nitty-gritty way you can use it for a strongman athlete, I think it's important to understand what GVT really is. At its core, GVT is a training method where you do 10 sets of 10 repetitions on a given exercise. However, I'm going to be referring heavily to Charles Poliquin's iteration of it, which was not just 10 by 10, but often uses antagonist supersets where you might superset something like a press and a pull, or you may do something such as a hamstring curl and a back squat. You wouldn't, for example, superset an RDL with a squat just because that'd be too much lower back loading in a given session. One of the big benefits of Charles's method of GVT was work density. You got a lot done in a very short amount of time. On screen right now, you can see an example session of what it might look like if you were doing GVT with him. So you'd have your initial antagonist superset, and then after that, just a couple more exercises done with a more standard set and rep scheme as opposed to another 10 by 10 coupling. So as far as why GVT works, I think it's pretty simple to understand. You're going to have a very high degree of density on a given session, and density is one of those incredibly underrated variables for a strongman athlete's development, because what that means is you're building that work capacity with time constraints. And if you think about strongman, density is one of those things that every event operates on a time cut. It is work within a time constraint. Additionally, the high density nature, the high volume nature of GVT lends itself well to learning how to express strength while in a state of cardiovascular and muscular fatigue, which is very much part and parcel for the strongman athlete. When you're going for high rep events, when you're in a multi-event show, fatigue is going to be present. You can't simply always avoid it in training and then hope for the best come competition day. In general, you're going to fall to the level of your preparation, so learning how to express strength in a state of fatigue is going to help raise the floor of your capabilities. Now, one thing worth mentioning too is when you perform 10 sets of a given exercise, that gives you 10 opportunities for a first rep to really help practice and refine your technique and setup. Obviously, 10 by 10 on something like a power clean, you're not going to really develop high quality form, but getting 10 first reps on a clean and doing something like 10 doubles, then you're getting a lot of opportunity to improve your tech on that given movement. Which really segues into the next thing I want to discuss, which are limitations of GVT for the strongman athlete. The same thing that makes GVT a viable contender for strongman, it's a double-edged sword because that high level of fatigue accumulation you're going to get running a proper GVT block means you can't run it sustainably for a long period of time. So naturally we want to look into adaptations for that, which we will talk about. The other big limitations when it comes to GVT are understanding that for a strongman athlete, we have to train at relatively high loads. Even 60% for a strongman athlete, for example, it's going to be much heavier than 60% for a Gen Pop client, which means you're going to accumulate more fatigue, which just causes problems with recovery and sustainability for this. Now, the last thing worth mentioning is technique. Training at very low intensities is not going to build your form with heavy loads. And it's one of those things where obviously we need to build volume, but if all you're doing is volume, when it comes time to push intensity, you do not have that neural drive. You don't have that confidence, that sort of tonus of the nervous system to really extract every bit of strength from yourself. So ultimately, while I wouldn't use GVT itself, that is the 10 by 10 antagonist supersets, for a strongman athlete, I think a lot of the underlying principles can be extremely valuable in a training block when applied correctly, which is what we're going to dive into next. So here's a few applications of how I actually go about using GVT-inspired programming with my own athletes or myself, and I think it's really important to flag this right up front. I almost never use the antagonist supersets in these adaptations. I think the original structure did make a lot of sense for bodybuilding type athletes in that you had a lot of bandwidth for recovery. For strongman athletes, I think I'd rather lean into the density and just drop the pairing entirely. That way we can focus on pushing correctly rather than pushing to the point of beyond fatigue and simply accumulating exhaustion rather than accumulating quality of movement. So the first application is pretty simple. This is just using 10 by 10 as a short-term shock cycle. And what I'll often do here is I'll pick an accessory movement that bleeds into an event. For example, if an athlete has a sandbag or stone load event coming in, I might have them do a couple weeks of 10 by 10 deficit pendlay rows. Because what that's going to do is build up all the relevant musculature and positioning for a good pick on the given implement. The second one, and probably my favorite adaptation of GVT, is advanced German volume training. This actually does come from Charles Poliquin. After a certain point, he said that a sufficiently strong athlete doesn't get much benefit from sets beyond 5 repetitions. And the idea here is you'd start at 10 sets of 5 at roughly 75% or so. Recognizing that you would lose repetitions, you were supposed to build to 10 sets of 3 at 90% or greater of your 1 rep max when starting this program. This is one that's going to get its own slide. I'm going to dive a bit deeper into it because advanced GVT has a lot of unique use cases and applications, but especially for pressing in my observation. The last adaptation that I like is hybrid agonist sets. This one, pretty much, rather than doing straight sets of a given movement, you're going to pick 2 movements that are complementary to one another, such as a deadlift and a kettlebell swing. Both are going to help reinforce the hinge mechanics. You're getting the volume and the density, but you're distributing that fatigue across 2 different movements instead of just hammering one pattern into the ground. This also helps you train at different velocities across the course of a session. So right from the rip, when it comes to advanced German volume training, I think one of the single best applications you can use with this modality is to pair it with the 40-degree incline press. The 40-degree incline press is one of those movements that should almost always be present in a strongman athlete's programming, in my opinion. It's going to build the log, it's going to build the axle. It's a good all-around pressing movement, and because you're seated, it doesn't beat up the low back too much, which means you're not going to eat into your recovery, especially during those times where you're pushing loading, you're pushing deadlifts, you're pushing squats. It plays really nicely. You could even do this after some push pressing. That way you're not losing the skill of the push press while still continuing to develop the relevant musculature for your pressing. So you'll see here I have 3 different iterations that are inspired by advanced GVT. The first one is going to be a good volume approach here. You're just doing sets across for 8 weeks. And then the other 2 are more of a modified accumulation to intensification phase. With the third one in particular, that one's actually in the Conjugate Kaiju 2 program because you move from density to advanced German volume training to help build a wide base of work capacity. And while I did state that I like this a lot for pressing, you could certainly use it for lower body movements such as the squat and the deadlift. Something I would recommend in that case is dropping 1 or 2 sets just based off of your current strength levels. In general, the stronger you are, you can probably get away with a little bit less volume. And with any of these protocols, I suggest adding weight every 2 to 3 sets based off how you're feeling that day. If you're not feeling good, obviously you would stay at the given load, but if you're having a great day, there's no reason you can't work up across the last few sets. In my observation, a lot of folks' strength tends to peak at around 7 or 8 sets in because their nervous system's really locked in on that given movement pattern. So that's just some food for thought. Last but certainly not least are hybrid agonist sets. I think these ones really do deserve their own slide. They are a unique application and honestly really fun. The idea is pretty gosh darn simple. Rather than just doing 10 sets of one given movement, you're going to do 5 rounds of 2 paired movements. So it's still 10 sets, but distributed a bit differently. And what I find happens is you accumulate volume and distribute it in such a way that it's a lot more survivable, as well as has a lot of transference to the demands of the sport, depending on the movements you pair. So for example, if you look at the pairings on screen right now, the deadlifts into kettlebell, that is going to be incredible for posterior chain conditioning and grip, depending on how you go about your deads. Back extensions into kettlebell swings, this will also double down on it. This would be a good one to do during a phase where maybe you're not doing any deadlifting, or to do it on a day away from your deadlifting after, say, speed squats. And then the sled pulls and rear delts, that's a great one for any sort of hypertrophy or conditioning focus block to help build a solid, reliable upper back. And then lastly, if you want to do sled drags into goblet squats, this would be good for prepping for a couple weeks before going into a high rep squatting block. So for example, if you are looking to build a 20 rep max on the squat, which is always a fun little side quest for the strongman athlete. So ultimately, GVT is not a strongman program. It was never meant to be a strongman program, but its principles apply really well to our sport. There's an Emerson quote. It says, "As to methods, there may be 1,000 and then some, but principles are few. The man who understands principles can adapt and use methods as he will, whereas the man who uses methods without understanding principles is certain to have trouble." So hopefully this gives you a good idea of understanding the key principles that make GVT work for the strongman athlete. And if you're looking to make the process even simpler, hit the link down below and apply for one-to-one coaching. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.